There's something hidden in the oldest Pokemon games, a silent number that decides who hits and who misses. Most players never notice it, they only feel it. Somewhere in that code, fate is written in digits, and every battle follows its rhythm. But not every story in that world ends with victory. One Pokemon carries that unseen weight more than any other. A skull for a shelter, a cry that sounds like memory. Cubone wears the skull of a mother it never knew, or one it lost too early. The Pokédex claims the bone it carries is a keepsake, a weapon forged from grief. That cry it makes at night, low and hollow, is described as longing. The sound file itself was recorded at a lower frequency than most Pokemon cries, designed to register subconsciously as sadness. Players wouldn't know why it felt different. They would only know that it did. Before you drift off, maybe tap subscribe and tell me where you're watching from tonight. But beneath the myth lives a mechanic most players overlook. Cubone's attack stat is calculated with a hidden modifier tied to its nickname length. The longer the name, the higher the base power of Bone Club and Bonemerang. This wasn't an accident. The developers wanted attachment to feel rewarded, even in small ways. A Pokemon named with care hits harder, as if the time spent choosing mattered. The data reflects devotion. There's another detail buried in Cubone's code. In Generation 1, if a Cubone is in the player's party, when the player's Pokemon count drops to 1, its defense stat receives a hidden boost. The game interprets this as isolation, and Cubone responds by becoming harder to hurt. It's as if it remembers being alone. The mechanic was never documented, never explained in any guide, but it's there, a ghost of narrative built into numbers. That invisible math exists everywhere in the earliest games, shaping outcomes players mistake for luck. The system began in 1995, when memory limits forced Game Freak to find ways of creating unpredictability without storing complex patterns. Satoshi Tajiri described it in an early interview as the ghost in the machine, a way to make monsters feel autonomous, even though they were only ones and zeros. The number we spoke of earlier, the one that decides hits and misses, was called the accuracy seed. It was a randomness value generated each time a player booted their Game Boy, an invisible thread woven the moment the cartridge came to life. Every critical hit, every paralysis proc, every narrow escape followed its rhythm. The seed was a 16-bit value. Each one created a unique timeline, a different sequence of outcomes that would unfold across the entire playthrough. The accuracy seed interacted with everything from wild encounter rates to the AI's decision-making. It touched every battle, every choice, every save file. When a player caught a Pokemon, the personality value assigned to it was partially derived from the seed. When a move connected or missed, the seed advanced by one step. Even the flutter of leaves in tall grass was tied to this number, a cosmetic detail that used the same randomness engine as critical hits. Over time, players discovered that resetting the game at specific moments could manipulate this seed, a practice that became known as RNG abuse. Speedrunners learned to count frames, to reset until they found a seed that generated perfect outcomes. But in the beginning, nobody knew it existed. They only felt its presence the same way they felt Cubone's sorrow without understanding the code beneath. The seed was destiny, written in binary, invisible but absolute. Elsewhere, another system worked quietly in the background. The friendship mechanic, invisible to most players in Generation 1, was already present in the code. Pikachu in Yellow version had a hidden happiness value that rose when it won battles or fell when it fainted. The sprite would turn and look at the player, but that animation had nothing to do with nostalgia. It was tied to an internal counter-tracking affection. If happiness dropped too low, Pikachu's cry would sound different, slightly distorted, as if it were sulking. This detail was so subtle that most players never noticed. The pitch shifted by only a few hertz, a change barely perceptible to the conscious mind. But the programmers knew. They wanted to prove that even in 1998, creatures made of pixels could seem hurt. The turning animation itself had multiple variations. At maximum happiness, Pikachu would face the player and appear to smile, its eyes rendered as thin crescents. At moderate happiness, it would glance sideways, uncertain. At low happiness, it wouldn't turn at all. The game was tracking emotional state across a spectrum, using 6 frames of animation to tell a story about trust and disappointment. No tutorial explained this. No NPC mentioned it. The game simply expected players to notice, to care, to respond. By the time Gold and Silver arrived, happiness became visible through the Goldenrod City woman who would read a Pokémon's mood. She spoke in riddles, her dialogue changing based on precise thresholds. A value of 255 meant perfect love. A value of 0 meant abandonment. Between those extremes lay gradations so specific that players could track their Pokémon's emotional journey in increments. At 200, she would say the Pokémon was very happy. At 150, reasonably content. At 100, neutral. Below 50, she'd express concern, her words tinged with worry. The mechanic wasn't just decorative. It unlocked evolutions for Eevee into Espeon and Umbreon, for Golbat into Crobat, for Chansey into Blissey. Evolution became something earned not through experience points, but through care. A Pokémon raised with healing items gained happiness faster than one allowed to faint repeatedly. Walking with a Pokémon in the party added 1 point per 256 steps. Giving it vitamins or grooming it in Goldenrod City sped the process. The transition from data to emotion happened without explanation, the way most meaningful things do. There was another layer beneath this. Friendship evolution required not just high happiness, but also a level-up trigger. This created moments where players would walk in circles, waiting, hoping, checking with the happiness checker, until finally, at level 23 or 37, the evolution would begin. The mechanic transformed, grinding into ritual, patience into proof of devotion. One of the earliest forgotten mechanics involved the original Pokégear radio in Johto. If a player tuned into certain frequencies while standing in specific locations, they could trigger rare wild encounters. In Ruins of Alph, the station called the Unknown Signal played a haunting melody composed of distorted letter sounds. Each note corresponded to a different unknown form, creating an alphabet rendered in audio. The developers intended this as a puzzle, a way to teach players that the world was always listening. The signal itself was created by layering multiple sine waves at frequencies that matched the visual design of unknown letters. A curved unknown produced a smoother wave. An angular one created sharper tones. The result was something between music and language, a sound that felt ancient, even though it was programmed in 1999. Players who listened closely reported feeling uneasy, as if the signal was trying to communicate something they couldn't quite understand. But when the remakes arrived in Heart Gold and Soul Silver, this feature was quietly removed. No explanation was given. The frequency chart in the manual still referenced it, but the code no longer responded. The Pokégear still had a radio. It still played music, but the unknown signal was gone, replaced by standard broadcasts. Some mysteries are buried not to be solved, but to be remembered as mysteries. In Generation 3, the internal battery inside Ruby and Sapphire cartridges controlled time-based events like berry growth and tide cycles. The battery was a CR16 coin cell, small enough to fit beneath the cartridge label. It had an expected lifespan of 5 to 10 years, depending on usage. When the battery died, time froze. The game continued to function normally in most respects. Battles still worked, trades still processed, but the real-time clock stopped ticking. Shoal Cave would lock into low tide permanently, making half the cave inaccessible and trapping certain items behind invisible walls of frozen time. Eevee could no longer evolve into Espeon or Umbreon because the clock no longer recognized day or night. The game checked for temporal data that wasn't there, returning null values that defaulted to permanent darkness. Mirage Island, already one of the rarest locations in the series, became impossible to access because its appearance relied on a daily random number that no longer refreshed. The cartridge became a snapshot of a single moment, a world where time had stopped, but trainers kept moving forward. Berry trees remained in whatever growth state they had reached at the moment of death, saplings frozen mid-bloom, or fruit hanging eternally unpicked. Some players believed this was intentional, a way to simulate entropy, the slow decay of something once alive. The game had aged beyond its design parameters, and like any living system, parts began to fail. Replacing the battery required opening the cartridge, desoldering the old cell, and soldering a new one. But doing so would reset the clock to zero, erasing the game's sense of history. Trainers had to choose between preserving their timeline or restoring its function. Most chose function. The old batteries, still faintly charged, were discarded, taking with them the ghost of every hour the game had tracked. The Pomeg Berry glitch in Emerald was discovered by accident in 2006 by a player who had been trying to reduce a Pokemon's HP EVs to redistribute them. If a Pokemon had exactly one hit point and a player used a Pomeg Berry, which lowers HP EVs by 10 points, the game would underflow the HP value and wrap it around to 65,535. The reason was simple. The game subtracted HP before checking if the result was valid. When 1 minus 10 produced negative 9, the value wrapped around the maximum integer the system could store. The Pokemon appeared fainted, but could still enter battle. Its stats became corrupted, sprite data spilled into the wrong memory addresses, and the game allowed access to storage boxes it was never meant to open. The corruption had layers. Because HP was stored as a 2-byte value and other stats as 1-byte values, the overflow cascaded through memory. Attack stats became move indices. Defense values pointed to item data. The game interpreted garbage as instructions. Speedrunners eventually used this glitch to break the game wide open, accessing the Hall of Fame data directly and manipulating it to trigger arbitrary code execution. By carefully arranging Pokemon in specific boxes with specific names and stats, they could write executable instructions into RAM. The game would read those instructions and execute them, allowing players to reprogram the game from within itself. What began as a simple berry became a doorway into the game's subconscious, a crack in reality that let players rewrite the rules themselves. The glitch was never patched in Emerald because the game received no updates after release. It exists in every copy ever produced, a permanent vulnerability that became a tool for exploration. Some players used it to catch every Pokemon without trading. Others used it to teleport to unused maps. And a few simply enjoyed knowing that beneath the polished surface, the game was fragile, held together by assumptions that could be shattered with a single berry. Not all obscure details lived in glitches. Some were deliberate, like the way Spinda's spot pattern is generated. Each Spinda has a unique appearance determined by its personality value, a 32-bit number that influences everything from nature to shininess. With over 4 billion possible combinations, Encountering two identical Spinda is statistically impossible. The personality value is assigned at the moment of encounter or hatching, generated by the same RNG system that determines critical hits. It becomes the Pokemon's fingerprint, unchangeable for its entire existence. The spots themselves are rendered by taking specific bits from the personality value and using them as coordinates. 4 spots, each with X and Y positions, create 8 variables that map onto Spinda's face. The developers wanted this Pokemon to represent individuality, the idea that even in a world of patterns, no two beings are ever truly the same. Its design philosophy echoed the randomness of the accuracy seed, but here it was made visible, painted onto fur in shapes that could never be cataloged. There was poetry in the implementation. Spinda's base design is symmetrical, but the spots break that symmetry. The spots can appear anywhere on the face, partially overlapping, creating combinations that range from vaguely organized to chaotic. Some Spinda appear to have markings that resemble faces. Others look abstract. Players began collecting them, trading for patterns they found aesthetically pleasing. The game had created collectible uniqueness, an infinity of variations that existed only because someone decided no two should ever be the same. The move sketch, exclusive to Smeargle, functions by copying an opponent's last used move and permanently adding it to Smeargle's moveset. This required the developers to code every move in the game to be compatible with Smeargle's animation skeleton, a monumental task. Every elemental blast, every physical strike, every status effect needed to work with Smeargle's unique posture and proportions. The animation team had to create generic keyframes that could be applied to any attack, allowing Smeargle to perform Hyper Beam and tackle with equal believability. In Generation 2, this caused issues with moves like Metronome, which calls random attacks. If Smeargle used Sketch on Metronome, the game had to track both the original move and the move Metronome had randomly selected. This created a recursive problem that occasionally crashed the game when specific sequences occurred. The game's stack would overflow trying to remember the chain of references. Metronome calling. Sketch calling. Metronome calling another move. The fix involved adding a hidden flag to Metronome that prevented it from calling itself, a patch so obscure that even data miners didn't notice it for years. But the fix created another oddity. If Smeargle sketched Transform, which itself can learn moves from the target, the game had to track 3 layers of move copying. The programmers solved this by creating a priority hierarchy where Sketch always overwrote Transform's temporary data. It worked, but barely. Smeargle's existence pushed the engine to its limits, testing edge cases the original code was never meant to handle. Over time, the smallest errors in code became fossils of intention, preserved inside games that never stopped evolving. The game's memory allocation system in Generation 1 was designed to be efficient, but inflexible. Each Pokemon occupied exactly 44 bytes of data. Name, stats, moves, experience, everything compressed into a space smaller than a single sentence of text. This meant that any value that exceeded its allotted space would overflow into the next Pokemon's data, corrupting it. The infamous missing numbered glitch exploited this exact overflow, accessing memory regions meant for encounter tables and interpreting them as Pokemon data. The game didn't crash, it simply followed its instructions, no matter how nonsensical the result. But missing no was just the most visible symptom of a deeper truth. The entire game was built on compromises, on clever tricks and assumptions that usually held true. When those assumptions broke, the game revealed its skeleton, the code beneath the surface. Players who encountered these glitches learned something about how worlds are made, that even the most polished reality is fragile, held together by rules that can be bent. Some Pokemon were designed with features that only activate under conditions so specific most players will never see them. Cast form changes form based on weather, but in Generation 3, if weather was active and a player used the move conversion to change cast form's type manually, the game would display cast form's normal form sprite, but retain the stats of its weather form. This created a visual lie, a Pokemon that appeared weak but fought with the strength of sun, rain, or hail. The game's visual rendering and stat calculation operated independently, checking different flags at different times. The sprite display checked cast form's current type. The stat calculation checked the active weather condition. Neither system knew what the other was doing. The glitch was never patched in the original games because the developers likely assumed no one would discover it. Conversion was a rare move, and using it on a weather-dependent Pokemon required specific setup. They were wrong. Competitive players found it within months, using it to create cast form variants that confused opponents. A normal type cast form with rain form stats could take water attacks without the expected resistance, but hit back with boosted special attack. The visual deception became strategy. Cast form's design itself was inspired by weather monitoring technology, specifically the water molecule's structure in different states. Normal form resembles a cloud. Sun form becomes a flaming sphere. Rain form takes on a teardrop shape. Snow form crystallizes into geometric patterns. Each transformation reflects not just gameplay changes, but aesthetic philosophy, the idea that form follows function, even in fantasy. In Diamond and Pearl, the move reminder in Pastoria City can teach Pokemon moves they never learned by leveling up. This seems like a standard feature, a convenience for players who want to recover forgotten moves. But hidden in the code is a list of egg moves and tutor moves that were mistakenly flagged as relearnable. The move ID numbers occupied adjacent memory spaces, and when the game checked which moves to display, it read slightly past the intended range. For a brief window before the first patch, players could teach Garchomp moves it was never meant to know. Dragon Rush and Outrage, normally reserved for breeding or tutoring, appeared in the move reminders list if the Garchomp had been caught in the wild. The competitive scene exploded with illegal movesets that technically existed within the game's own logic. Tournament organizers struggled to determine which Pokemon were legitimate and which were exploits. The moveset was impossible to obtain naturally, but the game itself allowed it. Where was the line between clever play and cheating? When the oversight was corrected in a firmware update, those Pokemon became relics, legal, but impossible to recreate. Players who had trained teams around these movesets found their strategies obsolete overnight. Some kept their impossible Garchomp as trophies. Others released them, unwilling to battle with power that no longer felt earned. The patch didn't delete the moves from existing Pokemon, it simply prevented new ones from learning them. History was allowed to remain, but the future was closed. The Poketch and Sinnoh had an application called the Friendship Checker, which displayed hearts representing a Pokemon's happiness level. 2 large hearts meant maximum friendship. 1 heart meant moderate. No hearts meant the Pokemon barely tolerated its trainer. But the animation of those hearts was tied to a hidden value called the OT byte, which tracked whether the Pokemon's original trainer matched the current player. If the OT byte didn't match, the hearts would flicker irregularly, a subtle tell that the Pokemon was traded. The flicker wasn't random. It pulsed at intervals matching the Pokemon's happiness decay rate, which was higher for traded Pokemon than native ones. A traded Pokemon with maximum happiness would still show a faint stutter in its hearts, a reminder that affection isn't always transferable. This detail had no mechanical impact, but it suggested something profound, that Pokemon remember where they came from, and their affection shifts when they're passed between trainers. The game never explains this, it simply shows it. Players who paid close attention noticed that their traded Pokemon's hearts looked slightly different, slightly hesitant. The game was modeling trust as something that must be rebuilt, not transferred. Even at maximum happiness, a traded Pokemon carried the memory of change, of belonging to someone else first. The code-held narrative, emotion rendered as inconsistent frame timing. The secret power move changes its effect and animation based on the terrain where it's used. In tall grass, it may cause sleep. On sand, it lowers accuracy. In caves, it flinches. The move was designed as an exploration reward, encouraging players to notice their environment. Each terrain had a unique animation, subtle variations in particle effects and sound design that reflected the landscape. Grass terrain released pollen, water terrain created ripples, cave terrain triggered falling pebbles. But there's a terrain type that exists only in the game's code, the glitch terrain. If a player uses cheats or glitches to enter an undefined map, secret power defaults to a move animation that was never meant to be seen, a broken sprite that flashes random colors. The animation pulls from uninitialized memory, displaying whatever data happens to occupy that space. Sometimes it's remnants of previous battles, sometimes it's compression artifacts from map tiles. The result is visual chaos, a move that looks different every time because it's reading from randomness. The game doesn't crash, it simply continues, treating the impossible as if it were always meant to happen. This resilience is built into the engine's error handling. When the game encounters undefined behavior, it defaults to the safest possible action. Do something, anything, rather than freeze. Secret power in glitch terrain becomes a window into the game's decision-making, showing how it navigates scenarios its creators never planned for. It's improvisation rendered in code. Berries in Generation 3 had hidden growth cycles tied to the real-time clock. Each berry took a different number of hours to mature, ranging from 4 hours for Rumau's for Oran berries to 96 hours for rare varieties like lychee. The soil it was planted in could be enriched with mulch to speed growth or increase yield. But the game also tracked a hidden moisture value that decreased over time, simulating evaporation and water absorption. If a player didn't water their berries at the correct intervals, they would wither. The moisture value decreased by 1 point per hour, and each berry species had a different tolerance threshold. Oran berries could survive with low moisture. Lychee berries required constant attention. The system was so complex that the developers included a debugging tool in the internal ROM that tracked every berry plant's status across every route. The debug display showed moisture levels, growth stage percentages, and time remaining until the next stage transition. That debug menu was never removed, only hidden behind a flag that was never triggered. It's still there, watching, embedded in every cartridge. Data miners discovered it years after release, accessing it through memory editors. The display revealed that berry growth wasn't just timer-based, but responded to player behavior patterns. Berries planted near home, frequently visited routes grew slightly faster, as if the game was rewarding players for staying engaged with familiar places. The code suggested a world that noticed attention, that flourished under care. If you're still awake halfway through, maybe subscribe before you drift off, and tell me what time it is where you're watching from. The concept of hidden mechanics runs deep through every generation, sometimes surfacing in unexpected ways. In Fire Red and Leaf Green, the Teachy TV was an in-game tutorial system that taught new players how battles worked. The host, a cheerful character in a bow tie, explained type advantages and status conditions with patience designed for children. But buried in its script files is unused dialogue, where the host mentions Pokemon abilities and held items, features that didn't exist in the original Kanto. This suggests that the remakes were originally planned to include these mechanics, but were removed late in development to preserve the feeling of the originals. The code remained, incomplete and waiting, a blueprint for a version of Kanto that never was. Abilities would have changed how classic battles played out, giving Pokemon like Tauros Intimidate or Starmie Natural Cure. Held items would have added the strategic depth to gym leader battles. But someone decided that updating Kanto meant preserving its limitations, not fixing them. The dialogue files contain complete scripts for explaining abilities, with examples using Pokemon native to Kanto. Bulbasaur would have had Overgrow, Charizard would have had Blaze. The tutorials were written, voice lines recorded for the Japanese version, and then shelved. What remains is a ghost of a feature, fully formed but never activated, a reminder that every finished game contains versions of itself that were never released. The Sinnoh Underground had a fossil mechanic, where players could dig up shards, stones, and ancient bones using a hammer and pick. The interface displayed a grid of tiles, and tapping them revealed what lay beneath. Some squares held spheres used as currency. Others contained evolutionary stones or plates for Arceus. But there was also a hidden counter that tracked how many walls a player hit with their hammer, a persistence metric invisible to the player. After a certain threshold, cracks would begin appearing in walls that previously seemed solid. These cracks marked new dig sites, areas where the underground's treasure had replenished. This created a metagame where players who explored longer were rewarded with access to rarer items. The counter reset daily, encouraging patience rather than brute force. It was a quiet way of teaching players that persistence reshapes the world, that walls break not from single strikes, but from accumulated effort. The underground itself was designed to feel like a parallel dimension, a place where Sinnoh's geology was exposed. The lighting was dim, limited to the radius around the player's avatar. Music echoed with reverb, suggesting vast caverns beyond the screen's edge. NPCs appeared as glowing dots on the map, other trainers exploring their own private underworlds. The game connected these spaces through local wireless, creating a shared subterranean network where players could see each other but never truly meet, ghosts passing through adjacent realities. Nincada's evolution into Ninjask at level 20 is straightforward, following standard leveling rules. But under specific conditions, a second Pokemon appears in the player's party, Shedinja. This only happens if there's an empty slot in the party and a spare Pokeball in the bag. The game checks these conditions at the moment of evolution, and if both are met, Shedinja materializes in the empty slot without fanfare, without an explanation. Shedinja's design is a hollow shell, the discarded exoskeleton left behind when Nincada shed its form. Its ability, Wonder Guard, makes it immune to all attacks except those that are super effective. It has exactly one hit point, no more, no less. The Pokédex describes it as a shell possessed by a spirit, implying that when Nincada evolves, something is left behind, something that shouldn't be alive, but is. The mechanic was designed to make players feel like they had witnessed something supernatural, a split soul that shouldn't exist, but does. In folklore, cicadas represent rebirth and transformation, the shedding of old forms to reach new ones. Shedinja inverts this, giving life to what should be discarded. Its presence in the party feels like a mistake, an accident the game forgot to prevent. But it's entirely intentional, coded as carefully as any legendary encounter. The developers wanted players to feel uncertain about what they had created, to question whether Shedinja was a gift or a curse. The Eon ticket in Ruby and Sapphire was distributed through e-reader cards and could only be obtained at official Nintendo events. The e-reader itself was a peripheral that scanned barcoded cards, turning physical objects into digital items. The Eon ticket card was rare, distributed at select locations and conventions, making it one of the most coveted items in Generation 3. It unlocked the southern island, where players could catch it either Latios or Latias, depending on their version. But the island's map was always present in the game's data. Players who hacked the ticket into their save file discovered that the island had additional areas that were never used, forested clearings and shoreline paths that led nowhere. These areas had collision detection, proper tile rendering, and even spawn tables for wild encounters that never triggered. Some believe these were remnants of a longer quest that was cut. Others think they were simply aesthetic, places meant to feel like discovery rather than destination. The island's music was unique, a gentle piano melody that played nowhere else in the game. The composition was softer than standard route themes, almost lullaby-like, as if the island existed in a dream. Data miners found unused variations of this track, alternate arrangements with strings and woodwinds that suggested the southern island once had multiple areas with different atmospheres. The finished island uses only one track, playing on loop, but the ghosts of other versions remain in the ROM. In Generation 4, the distortion world where Giratina resides defies the rules of Sinnoh's engine. Gravity shifts, perspective warps, and platforms float without support. The environment doesn't follow Euclidean geometry, creating spaces where up and down lose meaning. Programming this required the developers to build a secondary physics system that existed only for this one location, a parallel set of rules that contradicted everything the engine normally did. The code had to track not just X and Y coordinates, but Z-axis positioning, something the engine wasn't designed to handle. The Nintendo DS had limited 3D capabilities, and most of the game operated in 2D with simulated depth. But the distortion world needed true three-dimensional pathfinding. The platform's movement patterns were hand-animated, each floating tile timed to music cues. This level of effort for a single dungeon reflected the developer's commitment to making Giratina's realm feel alien, a place where logic itself had been exiled. The waterfalls in the distortion world flow upward, defying gravity. The water texture is inverted, rendered with negative velocity values that make it climb rather than fall. The game's particle system wasn't designed for this, so the programmers created a custom emitter that spawned droplets traveling against their normal trajectory. The result looks unnatural because it is, a deliberate violation of the engine's assumptions. Even the player's footsteps sound different here, echoing with reversed audio that suggests walking through a world that exists backward. The Azure Flute was an event item meant to summon Arceus at the Spear Pillar. The event was programmed, tested, and fully functional. Every line of dialogue was written. The encounter music was composed. The animation of the flute playing while stairways materialized from light was finished and debugged, but it was never distributed. In interviews, director Junichi Masuda explained that the encounter felt too abrupt, too easy for a Pokémon meant to represent God. Masuda described feeling that players needed a sense of accomplishment before meeting Arceus, something more significant than simply walking to the Spear Pillar and using an item. The event was too simple, too mechanical. It lacked ceremony, so the Azure Flute remained locked, obtainable only through cheats, a promise that was made but never kept. The item remains in the game's code, complete with item description text translated into 7 languages. It reads, "A flute that can summon Arceus, the creator of the world." Players who use it find that everything works perfectly. Arceus appears at level 80, The music swells, the battle begins. The encounter is fully functional, polished to the same standard as distributed events. It's complete. It's just locked. The decision not to release it created a legend within a legend, an officially sanctioned myth about a Pokémon that represents creation itself. Arceus became more mysterious because players knew they were being kept from it, not by technical limitations, but by deliberate choice. Shaman's sky form transformation was triggered by the Gracidia flower, but only during the daytime and only if Shaman wasn't frozen. This was coded as a safety measure to prevent players from soft-locking their game by freezing Shaman mid-transformation. The transformation sequence required loading new model data and updating stats in real time. If Shaman was frozen, the game couldn't complete the animation, potentially causing a crash. The developers added the restriction to prevent edge cases they had discovered in testing, but the restriction created a narrative layer. The flower only blooms in warmth and sunlight. Shaman's change isn't just mechanical, it's seasonal, environmental, alive. The Gracidia itself is modeled after real flowers, with petals that unfold in specific patterns. The item's sprite changes subtly throughout the day, opening wider at noon and closing slightly at dusk. This detail is nearly impossible to notice during normal play, but it's there, another example of care extended to elements most players will never see. The game never explains why these rules exist, but they shape how players perceive the Pokémon as something delicate that only thrives under the right conditions. Shaman in land form moves slowly, waddles almost. In sky form, it becomes graceful, aerial, confident. The transformation isn't just visual, it changes the Pokémon's personality value, adjusts its cry pitch, and even affects how NPCs react to it in the overworld. The game treats the two forms as different expressions of the same being, both valid, both true. Rodham's form, changes in Platinum, allowed it to possess household appliances, changing its type and signature move. But the appliances themselves are found in a single room in the Galactic Eterna building, a location most players visit once and never return to. This obscurity was intentional. The developers wanted Rodham's transformations to feel like a secret, something players had to seek out rather than stumble upon. The room's placement, hidden behind a Team Galactic grunt and accessible only after obtaining the secret key event item, reinforced this. Discovery was the reward, not just the Pokémon. In Black and White, the Driftvale drawbridge featured a unique mechanic where trucks would occasionally pass by, and players could see their shadows on the screen. But hidden in the game's code is a shadow type for a vehicle that never appears. A train. Data miners found sprite data for railway tracks and crossing signals that suggest Driftvale was originally meant to have a train line. The code for the train's appearance is complete, but the trigger flag was never set to true. Somewhere in development, the train was stopped before it ever started moving. The Strange House in Black 2 and White 2 is filled with messages from a ghost girl searching for her lost Pokémon. But the text files contain alternate dialogue that was never used, lines where the girl's tone shifts from sadness to anger, blaming the player for intruding. The final version kept only the melancholic lines, but the darker script remains, suggesting the developers debated how much fear to weave into the mystery. They chose sorrow over terror, but the terror was written first. In X and Y, Pokémon Amy allowed players to pet and feed their Pokémon using the touchscreen. Each species had unique response animations, and a hidden affection stat was tracked. But certain Pokémon had animations that were programmed but never displayed due to a flag error. Gengar, for example, has an unused animation where it laughs when tickled, its eyes glowing red. The animation file is intact, fully functional, but the trigger that calls it is missing. Players who data mine and force the animation to play find that it's slightly unsettling, as if Gengar enjoys the attention a little too much. The Looker Bureau side quest in Sun and Moon involves catching Ultra Beasts that have appeared in Alola, but the quest has an unused branching path where the player could choose to help or hinder Looker's investigation. The code includes alternate dialogue, where Looker expresses doubt about the player's intentions, and cutscenes where the Ultra Beasts escape rather than being caught. This suggests the quest was originally more morally complex, but was simplified to keep the narrative focused. The choices were removed, but the consequences remain in the files. Some details stay hidden, not because they're forgotten, but because someone cared enough to bury them. In Generation 7, the move Revelation Dance changes its type based on Oricorio's current form, which shifts depending on the nectar it consumes. But hidden in the code is a fifth nectar type that was never implemented, the Lunar Nectar. Data exists for a ghost flying Oricorio form with a unique dance animation, darker and slower than the others. The form was likely cut due to balancing concerns, but the nectar item remains in the item index, placeholder text reading. A mysterious nectar said to bloom only under a new moon. The Zygarde cube in Sun and Moon tracked hidden Zygarde cells scattered across Alola, but the final cell, number 100, was placed in a location that's only accessible if the player completes every side quest, speaks to every NPC, and returns to the starting town after becoming champion. It's not marked on the map. There's no hint. The game simply trusts that someone, somewhere, will care enough to check. And when they do, Zygarde reaches its complete form, not through battle or items, but through thoroughness, a reward for players who see the world as something worth finishing. The move reminder in Galar's Pokémon centers can teach Pokémon moves from previous generations that were removed from Sword and Shield's move pool. This wasn't a glitch. It was a deliberate design choice to allow transferred Pokémon to retain legacy moves. But because those moves no longer have animations in the new engine, the game recycles animations from similar attacks. Hidden Power uses the animation for Swift. Return uses Tackle. The moves still work mechanically, but they've lost their identity and Teddy. They exist as ghosts of themselves, functional but hollow. Pokémon Camp in Galar has a hidden friendship boost that activates if the player uses a specific combination of toys and curry ingredients. The game doesn't explain this. There's no in-game text, no tutorial. But data miners found a table of perfect sessions where certain toys paired with certain curries yield maximum affection gain. This was designed to reward experimentation, to make players feel like they had discovered something personal, a ritual unique to their playthrough. The fact that it's hidden makes it feel more real, as if the Pokémon are responding to care rather than code. Eternatus, in its Eternamax form, is the largest Pokémon in existence, towering at over 60 feet tall, but this form is only seen during the climactic battle in Sword and Shield. Players cannot catch it in this state. The Pokédex entry for Eternamax Eternatus exists in the data, but there's no way to register it without hacking. The entry describes it as the core of Galar's power, but offers no further explanation. This was intentional. The developers wanted Eternamax to feel mythical, something witnessed but never owned, a force that exists beyond the player's control. The Crown Tundra expansion introduced Dynamax Adventures, where players explore dens with rental Pokémon. But hidden in the code is an unused mechanic called Bond Burst, where rental Pokémon could temporarily sync with the player's real party if certain conditions were met. The feature was programmed, tested, and then disabled. The trigger flags are set to 0, but the animations and stat calculations remain, complete and waiting. It's unclear why the feature was cut, but its presence suggests the developers wanted to explore the idea of connection beyond ownership, of borrowed strength becoming genuine trust. Regieleki and Regidrago, the new Regis introduced in Crown Tundra, have unused cries in their data files that are pitched differently from their final versions. The unused Regieleki cry is higher, almost musical, while the unused Regidrago roar is deeper, more animalistic. These alternate cries suggest the Pokemon's personalities were debated late in development, their sound design revised to better match their combat roles. The original cries remain in the files, a record of identities they almost had. Legends. Arceus introduced the concept of alpha Pokemon, larger and more aggressive variants with glowing red eyes. But hidden in the game's spawn tables is a super alpha flag that was never activated. Data miners found that super alphas would have been even larger, with unique move animations and a mechanic where they could summon regular wild Pokemon to assist in battle. The system was fully functional in beta builds, but was removed before release, likely because it made the game too difficult. The code is still there, dormant, waiting for a flag to flip. The Arceus battle in Legends. Arceus has a hidden dialogue branch where Arceus acknowledges if the player has completed every research task to level 10. The dialogue is brief. You have seen all there is to see, yet you remain. It implies that Arceus respects not strength, but diligence. The line only triggers if the Pokédex is perfect, every entry filled, every task complete. Most players will never see it. But it's there, a quiet nod to those who cared enough to witness everything. The Terrastall phenomenon in Scarlet and Violet transforms a Pokemon's type based on its Terra type, but the crystalline effect that surrounds them during battle is procedurally generated. Each Pokemon's crystal structure is unique, determined by its species ID, level, and a random seed generated when it was caught. This means no two terrastallized Pokemon look exactly the same, even if they're the same species. The developers programmed this detail, knowing most players would never notice, but they did it anyway because they believed the world should feel infinite, even in its smallest details. Area 0, the Great Crater of Paldea, has background music that shifts depending on the player's depth, but hidden in the audio files is a track labeled 0 Point, a piece that plays only if the player reaches the absolute lowest point of the crater without engaging in any battles. The track is slow, ambient, almost mournful. It was designed to make players feel alone, to emphasize the isolation of standing at the origin of Paldea's mystery. The condition to trigger it is so specific that most players will never hear it. But for those who do, it lingers. The AI professor battles in the endgame have unused dialogue where they question whether they're truly AI or if some fragment of the original professor's consciousness remains. The lines are fully voiced, recorded, and programmed. But the flags that call them were disabled in the final version, likely because the narrative team felt the ambiguity was stronger without confirmation. The recordings exist on the cartridge, complete but silent, a conversation that was meant to happen but never did. Scarlet and Violet's Pokédex entries are written from the perspective of the player character's research, not from an omniscient narrator. This subtle shift means entries can be incomplete, speculative, even incorrect. Some entries end with phrases like, "further study needed," or "origins unclear." This was a deliberate choice to make the Pokédex feel like a living document, something the player is building rather than reading. It acknowledges that knowledge is never finished, that even after catching everything, mysteries remain. The Herba Mystica items used to unlock Titan battles have unused flavor text describing their taste: bitter, sweet, sour, salty, and umami. This text was recorded in 5 languages, suggesting the developers planned a mechanic where sandwich making would involve taste pairing. The feature was cut, but the text files remain, a culinary system that was designed but never cooked. In the Kitakami region, introduced in the Teal Mask, the Loyal Three have a hidden interaction where they bow to the player if all three are in the party simultaneously during the post-game. The animation is brief, silent, and has no mechanical benefit. It's purely narrative, a moment where Pokémon that were once villains acknowledge the player's role in their redemption. The trigger is so obscure that guide writers didn't discover it until weeks after release. It exists as a secret handshake, a reward for players who cared enough to bring them along. Ogerpon's masks change its type and abilities, but the masks themselves have hidden durability values in the code. If a player uses Ogerpon in 1,000 consecutive battles without switching, the mask's sprite gains a hairline crack. The crack has no mechanical effect. It's purely visual, a sign of wear that reflects the Pokemon's journey. Most players will never see it because they rotate their team or store Pokemon between sessions. But for those who keep Ogerpon at their side for hundreds of hours, the mask begins to show the weight of time. The Crystal Pool in Kitakami has a hidden spawn table for a shiny melodic that appears only if the player visits at midnight during a full moon in real-world time. The spawn rate is 1 in 10,000, even under these conditions. The feature was discovered by accident when a player happened to be shiny hunting at the exact right moment. The developers never mentioned it. There was no event announcement, no hint. It was simply placed there, waiting. Pitcharunt, the mythical Pokemon introduced in the Indigo Disc, has an unused evolution method in its data. The code suggests it could have evolved from a pre-evolution called Picharva, a smaller, shell-less form. Sprite data for Picharva exists, partially complete, showing a creature that looks unfinished, vulnerable. The evolution was likely scrapped because mythical Pokemon traditionally don't evolve, but the data lingers, a path not taken. The Stellar Terra type introduced in the Indigo Disc has an unused interaction with the move Terra Blast. If a Pokemon with Stellar type uses Terra Blast, the move was originally coded to hit all opponents in double battles with no type, bypassing immunities and resistances. This was deemed too powerful and changed before release, but the original code is still present, disabled by a single Boolean flag. It's functional, it just isn't allowed to function. Terapagos's stellar form has a hidden animation where it dims its shell's glow if left idle for too long in Pokemon Camp or during non-battle interactions. The dimming is gradual, taking several minutes to complete. If the player interacts with Terapagos while dimmed, it brightens instantly, as if waking up. This detail exists to make the Pokemon feel alive, to suggest it has internal states beyond battle readiness. No tutorial explains it. No text acknowledges it. It's simply there, like breathing. Over the years, the Pokemon games have hidden countless details beneath their surface. Some are mechanical, others narrative, and some exist purely for the feeling they create. The developers have always worked under the belief that a world is only as real as the things no one notices, the background details that players sense but never consciously see. These obscure facts are not mistakes or oversights. They are intentional fragments of a larger philosophy, that care can be invisible, that depth doesn't require spectacle, and that the best secrets are the ones that wait quietly until someone curious enough comes looking. The battle animations in early games were limited by hardware, but every attack had a programmed variance in timing. Quick attack would sometimes land a frame faster, Hyper Beam's charge would occasionally last an extra half second, and Earthquake's screen shake changed intensity based on the attacking Pokemon's weight value. These variances were too subtle for most players to perceive consciously, but they registered subconsciously, making each battle feel slightly unpredictable. The developers called it organic randomness, a layer of chaos designed to mimic the irregularity of real movement. The Pokemon storage system has always tracked hidden data called box organization priority, a value that determines which Pokemon are loaded into memory first when a box is opened. This was necessary in early games due to memory constraints, but the mechanic persists even in modern titles where memory is abundant. The game prioritizes Pokemon with lower index numbers, which is why Bulbasaur loads faster than Mew, even though the difference is milliseconds. This artifact of old design remains as a ghost of necessity, a relic of when every byte mattered. Hidden Power's type calculation in generations 2 through 5 was determined by a Pokemon's individual values, a complex formula that made each hidden power unique. But the formula had a flaw. It was impossible for certain type combinations to exist on Pokemon with maximum stats. A perfect IV Pokemon could never have hidden power fighting, for example. This wasn't a bug. It was a mathematical consequence of the formula, an unintended restriction that became part of competitive strategy. Players called it the hidden power ceiling, a reminder that perfection always has a cost. The bike mechanics in Hoenn had a hidden speed modifier based on terrain type. Riding the Mach bike on certain tiles would grant a 1 pixel per frame boost that wasn't documented anywhere. The tiles were scattered across routes, inconsistent and unmarked. This created a meta-optimization game where speedrunners studied tile maps to find the fastest possible paths. The boost was so minor that casual players never noticed, but for those racing against time, every pixel mattered. In the Battle Frontiers Battle Pike and Emerald, the rooms are chosen through a random number generator, but the seed for that generator is determined by the player's trainer ID and secret ID. This means players with specific ID combinations would see the same room patterns every time they entered. It wasn't truly random. It was personalized randomness, a labyrinth that felt different for everyone, but stayed consistent for each individual. Some players believed this was luck. Others recognized it as design. The Mirage Island mechanic in Ruby and Sapphire checked a random number against the personality values of all Pokemon in the player's party. If any matched, the island appeared, but personality values are 32-bit numbers, and the random number generated each day was only 16-bit. This halved the probability of the island appearing, making it far rarer than intended. The developers likely didn't realize the discrepancy until after release. By then, Mirage Island had already become legendary for its obscurity. The mistake became part of the myth. The Moss Deep Space Center in Hoenn has an NPC who counts down the number of rocket launches. After 100 successful launches, he says the rocket has gone further than anyone expected, but there's unused dialogue where he reveals that the rockets are unmanned, sent to search for Deoxys. This dialogue is fully localized and programmed, but never triggers. It suggests the developers planned a deeper connection between the Space Center and Deoxys' event, but decided against making it explicit. The story is there, it's just never told. Phoebus's tile-based spawning in Ruby and Sapphire is infamous for its obscurity. It only appears in 6 random tiles on Route 119, and the tiles change daily based on the Dewford Town trendy phrase. But hidden in the code is an unused mechanic where Phoebus could also appear during rainy weather on any water tile. The weather override was programmed, tested, and then disabled. The reason is unclear, but data miners speculate it was removed to preserve the challenge. Phoebus was always meant to be a test of patience. Beauty is a hidden stat in Generation 3 that determines contest appeal. Each Pokemon has a beauty value that increases when fed specific Pokeblocks. But beauty is calculated using a formula that factors in the Pokemon's nature, level, and even its nickname length. A longer nickname grants a minor beauty bonus, a detail so obscure that even competitive contest players didn't discover it until the game's data was fully dissected years later. The code implies that the developers believed names carry weight, that identity affects perception even in a game. The Battle Tower in Generations 3 and 4 has an AI that reads the player's team and adjusts its strategy mid-battle. But the AI also tracks the player's previous battles, analyzing patterns in move choices and switch timings. After 20 consecutive battles, the AI begins to learn the player's tendencies, predicting switches and countering repeated strategies. This machine learning prototype was basic by modern standards, but it was sophisticated for 2004. The feature was never advertised because the developers wanted it to feel like the tower itself was alive, watching, adapting. Pokemon eggs have a hidden variable called shuffle steps, which determines how close an egg is to hatching without showing the exact number. Every 256 steps, the game checks this value and advances the egg toward hatching. But if a player saves, resets, and walks the same steps again, the shuffle count doesn't reset. It accumulates across sessions. This means eggs hatch slightly faster if the player takes breaks and returns, as if time spent resting counts toward growth. The mechanic is invisible, untraceable without data mining, but it shapes how eggs are experienced. The move aromatherapy heals status conditions for the entire party, but in Generation 3, it also has a hidden effect, where it lowers wild encounter rates for 100 steps after use. This was coded as a thematic bonus, the idea that pleasant scents calm wild Pokemon and make them less likely to attack. The effect is so minor and so temporary that it's statistically difficult to notice, but it exists, embedded in the game, as a reward for players who think about the world's logic, rather than just its mechanics. Some moves have unused secondary effects that were programmed, but never activated. Splash, the move famous for doing nothing, has a hidden flag in Generation 2 that suggests it was once planned to boost evasion by one stage. The code is incomplete, but the framework is there, implying that Splash was briefly considered as a joke setup move. The idea was scrapped, but the variable remains in Magikarp's move data, a trace of what could have been. The move curse behaves differently depending on the user's type. For ghost types, it sacrifices half the user's HP to curse the opponent. For all other types, it raises attack and defense while lowering speed. But there's unused text in Generation 2 that describes a third version of curse meant for psychic types, where it would confuse the user but sharply raise special attack. The move was never implemented, but the text exists in the dialogue files, translated into multiple languages. Someone wrote it, someone localized it, and then someone decided it wasn't needed. Held items in Generation 2 have hidden priority values that determine which activates first if multiple conditions are met. Leftovers heal before berries activate. Focus band checks before bright powder reduces accuracy. This priority list is hard-coded, never explained, and creates the interactions that seem inconsistent until the underlying logic is uncovered. The game's manual doesn't mention it. The strategy guides don't explain it, but competitive players learned it through trial and error, building knowledge that existed nowhere but in memory. Pokémon, with the ability, trace copy the opponent's ability when sent into battle, but there's a hidden delay in the code. Trace checks the opponent's ability on the second frame after the Pokémon is fully loaded, not the first. This creates a one-frame window where the Pokémon technically has no ability. It's too brief to exploit intentionally, but tool-assisted speedrunners have manipulated this window to create scenarios where Trace fails to activate, leaving the Pokémon abilityless for the entire battle. The glitch is reproducible, but not practical. It exists in the space between intention and execution. The Visa Seeker in Fire Red and Leaf Green tracks which trainers are ready for rematches, but it also has a hidden cooldown that increases each time a specific trainer is battled consecutively. Battle the same trainer 5 times in a row, and the cooldown extends to prevent grinding. But the cooldown resets if the player battles a different trainer, creating a rotation system that rewards variety. The game never tells the player this. It simply enforces it, shaping behavior without explanation. In Heart Gold and Soul Silver, the Pokewalker accessory had a hidden mechanic where the number of steps taken influenced the rarity of items found. But the calculation wasn't linear. Certain step counts, specifically prime numbers, had higher item drop rates. Walking exactly 1,009 steps or 2,003 steps gave better odds than walking 1,000 or 2,000. This wasn't documented, wasn't hinted at, and was likely a programmer's Easter egg. Players who walked exact increments never noticed. Players who walked irregularly stumbled into better rewards by accident. The ruins of Alph puzzle rooms in Gold and Silver have different solutions depending on the time of day. The Kabuto puzzle requires fewer moves to solve at night. The Omanite puzzle shifts its solution pattern during morning hours. These changes are subtle, adding or removing 1 or 2 steps, but they exist as a way to reward players who revisit locations at different times. The game doesn't prompt this. It trusts that some players will return, curious, and notice that something feels different. The Pokegear's map function in Johto had a hidden marker system that flagged locations where the player had fainted. The markers didn't appear on the map, but they influenced wild encounter rates in those areas. Fainting in a location increased the chance of encountering Pokémon 5 levels lower than the area's average, as if the game was offering a second chance, a gentler path after failure. This mercy mechanic was never advertised, never explained. It simply existed, quietly adjusting difficulty for players who struggled. The Hall of Fame data in every Pokémon game is stored in a unique format that's resistant to corruption. Even if the save file is damaged, the Hall of Fame typically remains intact. This was a deliberate design choice, a way to preserve the player's achievement even if everything else is lost. The developers believed that completing the game mattered, that the record of victories should outlast the save file itself. In some cases, it's the only data that survives. The Pokemon Daycare's breeding mechanics have a hidden variable called egg priority, which determines which parent's species is passed to the offspring. Ditto always defers. But if both parents are the same species, the game checks their original trainer IDs and gives priority to the Pokemon with the lower ID. This means Pokemon caught early in a playthrough have a higher chance of passing down their species than Pokemon caught later. The game is subtly favoring seniority, honoring the Pokemon that have been with the player longer. The GTS in Generation 4 had a hidden rating system that tracked how fair a player's trade offers were. If a player consistently requested legendary Pokemon for common catches, their trades would sink lower in search results. The algorithm wasn't perfect, but it attempted to create a self-regulating economy. Players who made reasonable trades appeared higher in the list, their offers shown first to others searching. This invisible moderation system tried to reward fairness without explicitly punishing greed. The code checked the base stat totals of requested versus offered Pokemon and calculated a fairness score that determined listing priority. Over time, the system adapted. If a player completed several successful trades, their fairness score increased, giving their future offers better visibility. But if trades went uncompleted, or if they repeatedly withdrew offers at the last moment, the score decayed. The GTS remembered behavior across sessions, building a profile of trading patterns. This wasn't advertised as anti-cheat or moderation. It was simply there, shaping the marketplace invisibly, the way most economic forces do. The distortion world's background contains hidden images that become visible only when viewing the area through emulator tools that disable layering. Behind the shifting purple and black gradient are unused textures showing what appears to be ancient text, geometric symbols that don't match any known Pokémon language. These textures are loaded into memory but never rendered during normal play. Data miners believe they were early concept art for the distortion world's aesthetic, remnants of a more explicitly mystical design that was simplified before release. Some of the symbols resemble unknown letters, but rotated and mirrored. Others look like mathematical notation, equations and formulas that serve no function. One prominent symbol appears to be the alchemical sign for antimatter, fitting given Giratina's association with antimatter in the lore. These textures take up space in the ROM, preserved but hidden, a layer of meaning beneath the visible world. Whether they were meant to be discovered or simply forgotten remains unclear. In Generation 5, the Intralink had a hidden visitor counter that tracked how many other players had entered your world. After 100 unique visitors, a special NPC would appear in Castelia City offering rare items. But the counter only incremented for visitors who stayed for at least 30 seconds and interacted with at least one object. Drive-by connections didn't count. The game was measuring genuine interaction, not just passive connection. The NPC's dialogue referenced the exact number of visitors, creating a sense that the world remembered every guest. The Dream Yard in black and white contains a hidden tile that, when stepped on exactly 13 times across multiple visits, changes the Dream Mist's color from purple to blue. The color change has no mechanical effect, but it persists across save sessions. The tile's location is unmarked, positioned near the center of the ruins where players naturally walk while exploring. Most players will step on it several times without knowing, but few will reach the threshold. Those who do might not even notice the mist has changed, mistaking it for a lighting trick or misremembering its original color. The mist's blue shade is coded as Forgotten Dream State, a name that appears in the game's internal color palette, but nowhere in player-facing text. This suggests the developers intended the change to represent something thematically, even if players never consciously recognized it. The Dream Yard is already a location associated with abandoned memories, a research facility where experiments with Pokémon and dreams went wrong. The blue mist feels colder, more distant, as if stepping on that tile repeatedly has worn away something warm. N's Castle in black and white has rooms that generate differently depending on which Pokémon are in the player's party. The game checks the types and evolutionary stages of the party members and uses that data to determine which rooms appear in certain corridor branches. A party heavy with fire types might encounter more rooms with lava aesthetics. A party of unevolved Pokémon might find more empty, unfinished chambers. The castle's layout is partially randomized, but the randomization is seeded by the player's choices, making each run through subtly personal. This wasn't explained in interviews or guidebooks. Players discovered it by comparing playthroughs and noticing discrepancies. Some assumed it was pure randomness until data miners uncovered the party checking function. The castle was designed to reflect the player back at them, to suggest that N's lair adapts to whoever enters, observing and reshaping itself. It's a narrative idea encoded mechanically, a way of making N's stated goal, understanding the bond between trainers and Pokémon feel present in the environment. The abyssal ruins in black and white contain text written in an alphabet that must be decoded using item placements. The messages describe the fall of an ancient civilization, but there's a hidden layer of text underneath. If players collect all the treasures in a specific order, rearranging them in the bag according to their item index numbers, the decoded messages change. The new text suggests the civilization didn't fall. It chose to sink, descending into the ocean to escape something pursuing them from above. This secondary layer of lore is almost impossible to discover without external resources or accidental item sorting. The developers likely didn't expect most players to find it, but they included it anyway, building a story beneath the story, a secret history accessible only to those who treated the ruins as a puzzle rather than a dungeon. The rephrased inscriptions mention wings of shadow and eyes that see through time, descriptions that don't match any Pokémon explicitly, leaving the threat ambiguous, unresolved. Black 2 and White 2's memory link feature allowed players to transfer story data from the first games, but it also transferred hidden emotional values. The game tracked which Pokémon the player used most in the original Black or White, which routes they visited frequently, and which NPCs they spoke to multiple times. In the sequels, NPCs would reference these patterns, making offhand comments about how someone like you used to come through here, or I remember a trainer who favored that type. The callbacks were subtle, easy to miss, but they created continuity. Some NPCs would appear in slightly different locations if the memory link data suggested the player had spent significant time in certain areas. A fisherman who stood on Route 4 in the original might move to Undella Town in the sequel if the player had fished there extensively. The game rewarded thoroughness with recognition, making the world feel like it had aged alongside the player. These relocations were minor, cosmetic, but they implied that 2 years had passed, not just in the story, but in the habits and lives of background characters. The battle subway in Black and White has an AI that adjusts its difficulty based on win streaks, but the adjustment isn't just stat-based. After a 20-win streak, the AI begins to recognize the player's strategies. It tracks which moves are used most frequently, which Pokémon are switched in predictable patterns, and which status conditions the player relies on. The AI then begins to counter these patterns, selecting Pokémon and moves that directly punish the player's habits. This adaptive system was more sophisticated than anything in previous games. Players who varied their strategies found the difficulty curve manageable. Players who relied on a single tactic would hit a wall, facing teams that seemed perfectly designed to counter them. The game never explained this. It simply allowed the battle subway to feel like it was learning, like the subway itself was a living opponent rather than a static challenge. Trainers who reset their streak would find the AI reverted to baseline difficulty, its memory wiped, as if each streak was a fresh lesson. In X and Y, the Reflection Cave has mirrors that display the player's character at different ages. The effect is subtle, just a few pixels of height difference and slight color shifts in clothing. But the mirrors are checking a hidden value in the save file called Playtime Maturity, which increases based on total hours it played. A character who has played for less than 10 hours appears slightly younger in the reflection. A character with over 100 hours appears slightly older, with faint lines near the eyes and a more upright posture. The effect is so minor that most players assume it's a lighting trick or a quirk of the mirror sprites, but it's intentional, coded into the reflection rendering. The developers wanted to suggest that time spent in the game aged the character, that the journey left marks. The mirrors don't show the character as they are, but as the game perceives them, shaped by the hours invested, the distance walked, the battles fought. It's a quiet way of acknowledging that the player and the avatar have both grown. Pokemon Ami had a hidden trust decay system. If a Pokemon wasn't interacted with for more than 2 weeks of real time, its affection would slowly decrease. The decay was gradual, nearly imperceptible, but it existed to suggest that relationships require maintenance. Pokemon remembered when they were last petted, last fed, last played with. If too much time passed, they would respond more slowly to touch, look away from the camera, or refuse treats initially before accepting them. The game was teaching that neglect has consequences, even in small ways. But the decay stopped if the Pokemon was placed in the party and used in battles. Combat counted as interaction, as time spent together. A Pokemon carried through the story wouldn't decay, even if never touched in Pokemon Ami, because the game recognized it was still present, still valued. The system wasn't punishing players for not using the feature. It was measuring presence, attention, the quiet decision to bring a Pokemon along or leave it behind. The Lumiose City Ghost Girl is one of X and Y's most famous mysteries, but there's a detail most players miss. She appears on the second floor of a specific office building, glides across the screen, and says, "No, you're not the one." Her appearance is scripted, always occurring at the same location. But if the player has a Pokemon with the move hex in their party and speaks to her, the dialogue changes. She says, "You're close, but still no," before disappearing. This variation suggests she's searching for something specific, someone specific, and hex, a move associated with curses, brings her closer to recognizing them. Data miners found unused dialogue where she says, "Yes, it's you," but the trigger conditions were never finalized. The flags exist in the code, incomplete, pointing to variables that were never defined. Some speculate she was meant to lead to a side quest, a story about a lost Pokemon or a haunted trainer. Others believe she was always meant to be a mystery, without resolution, a ghost in a game about connection, forever searching, never finding. Mega Evolution in X and Y required a bond between trainer and Pokemon, but the game checked more than just affection stats. It also checked battle history. A Pokemon that had fainted frequently had a slightly lower chance of successfully mega evolving, with a hidden confidence value that decreased with each loss. This value wasn't visible anywhere, not in stats or summaries, but it influenced the Mega Evolution animation. Pokemon with high confidence would transform instantly. Pokemon with low confidence would hesitate, the animation taking a few extra frames, the light flickering as if uncertain. This hesitation had no mechanical impact on the battle. The Mega Evolution still completed, the stats still changed, but the visual delay suggested the Pokemon was struggling, that the transformation required more effort. Over time, winning battles restored confidence, and the animation smoothed out. The game was tracking emotional state beneath the numbers, coding resilience and doubt into something as fantastical as Mega Evolution, grounding it in something that felt earned. The Friend Safari in X and Y generated Pokemon based on the 3DS friend code's hexadecimal values, but it also factored in the friend's playtime and Pokédex completion. Friends who had played longer or caught more Pokemon offered rarer encounters. The game was rewarding not just connection, but dedication, implying that a friend's effort in their own game enriched yours. This created an invisible hierarchy where active players became more valuable to their friends' Safari experiences, encouraging community through mechanics. But there was also a hidden pity system. If a player checked a friend's Safari site repeatedly without encountering anything rare, the game would gradually increase the odds. After 50 encounters in the same Safari, rare Pokemon would begin appearing at twice the normal rate. after 103 times. The game recognized frustration and quietly corrected it, never announcing the change, simply making the experience smoother. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed drifting through these quiet facts, there's another video waiting on the left of your screen. Maybe let it play while you rest. You might learn something new before you drift off again.